$1.8 billion. That was the price of an anti-aircraft gun whose radar kept locking onto the wrong target. The M247 Sergeant York was supposed to be the fast, cheap answer to Soviet helicopters on the battlefield, built almost entirely from parts the Army already trusted. Across the early 1980s, the money came out of your pocket. What it bought was a machine that once swung its guns toward a stand full of visiting officers and once locked its radar onto the ventilation fan of a field latrine. This is the file on how a gun designed to clear the sky spent 8 years finding everything on the ground except its target. The gun the Army wanted in a hurry. By the late 1970s, Soviet attack helicopters had learned a move the Army could not answer. A helicopter would sit low behind a tree line or a ridge, hidden from view, then rise for a few seconds, fire a missile at an American tank, and drop back into cover before any gunner could react. The newest of these aircraft, the one Western planners watched most closely, could knock out a tank from well beyond rifle range. Against tanks, the United States had answers. Against this, it had almost nothing that could keep up with an armored advance. The reason was a string of earlier failures. A sophisticated air defense missile called the Mauler had been promised in the 1960s and never worked, and the stopgaps that replaced it, the Vulcan and the Chaparral, rode on slow chassis that could not stay with the new M1 Abrams tank and the M2 Bradley as they moved. So in 1977, the Army wrote a requirement for a new gun that could travel with its armor and bring down whatever came at it from the air. The requirement carried an unusual instruction. To save time and hold down cost, the new weapon was to be assembled, as far as possible, from parts that already existed and already worked. The hull would come from the old M48 Patton tank, thousands of which sat in storage. The guns would be a proven Swedish design. The heart of the system, the part that would find the target and aim the weapon, would be a radar adapted from sets the military had already fielded. That radar is where this story lives. It was the eye and the brain of the whole machine. Everything the gun did, it did because the radar told it what to look at and where to point. The Army's bet was that bolting together trusted pieces would be faster and cheaper than starting clean, and that the hardest engineering had already been done by someone else. On paper, the integration looked like the easy part of the job. The program had a name that read like a promise of its own. Officially, it was the Division Air Defense Gun, shortened in the paperwork to D5AD. Later, it would be named the Sergeant York, after the Tennessee marksman who won the Medal of Honor in World War I for the accuracy of his rifle. A weapon named for the finest shot in the Army's memory would, in time, become known for what it could not hit. The Army wanted this gun, and it wanted it soon. The threat was real, the gap in the field was real, and the logic of using proven parts to move quickly was sound enough that few people inside the program argued with it. The question of who would build the thing came down to two companies, and in the spring of 1981, the Army made its choice. Ford wins on a fixed price. Two finalists remained from an original field of 5. The Army had run the competition as a kind of race, letting each company build and try its own design, rather than handing down a detailed blueprint on the theory that competition would push both towards something cheaper and better. By the spring of 1981, the choice was between Ford Aerospace and General Dynamics, and in May, the contract went to Ford. The whole approach had a name inside the Pentagon. It was an accelerated strategy, meant to put a weapon in the field in about 6.5 years, instead of the dozen that major Army programs often took. The Army ran development with a light hand, keeping its own oversight thin and limiting who could see each contractor's work, partly to guard company secrets and partly to keep the loser from protesting the award. Speed was the point. That same speed, which looked so efficient on a schedule chart, would later mean that serious trouble inside the gun stayed hidden until the program was already deep into production. The terms were built to protect the people paying the bill. Ford signed a fixed-price contract for development, which meant the company, not the taxpayer, would absorb the cost of solving problems that came up along the way. The deal included 3 production options to be exercised 1 year at a time at prices agreed in advance. The first 2 of those options, for 50 and then 96 fire units, were priced at $350.1 million and $438.5 million. On top of that, the contract carried warranty terms stronger than those on most weapons of the day, making Ford responsible for fixing defects without reaching back into the treasury for more money. The machine those papers described was the borrowed parts idea made solid. A new turret holding twin 40mm Bofors guns sat on the hull of the M48 Patton, with the radar perched above to find the targets and run the guns. It stood tall and heavy, built to roll alongside the Army's newest tanks and shield them from the air. For the men approving the money, the warranty was the thing they could point to. Other programs in those years ran far past their estimates, and the fixed price structure on the Sergeant York was supposed to make that impossible. If the gun fell short of the contract's written specifications, Ford had to make it right on Ford's own money. By the measure everyone watched most closely, the cost, the contract did exactly what it was designed to do. The price held. The warranty covered one thing: performance against the specifications written into the contract. Whether a gun that satisfied every line of those specifications would actually work in a field against a real helicopter, in weather and dust and the confusion of a battlefield, was a separate question the contract left open. That distinction would matter more than anyone signing in 1981 expected. The first time the Army gathered an audience to watch the new gun perform, the distinction announced itself. The turret swings to the stands. Officers from 2 armies gathered at Fort Bliss in February 1982 to watch the new system perform. The guests included senior American officers and a delegation from Britain, the kind of audience a contractor assembles when it believes it has something to show. A target had been set out for the gun to find and track. Cameras were ready. The fire control computer was switched on. The turret came to life and began to rotate. It kept going past where the target sat and swung around toward the crowded reviewing stands until the long twin barrels were pointing at the audience. People got up fast and moved out of the way. No one was seriously hurt, though the scramble was real. And for a few seconds, the most advanced air defense gun the Army had ever bought had its guns trained on the men who had come to admire it. It is worth being precise about what happened, because the legend has grown taller than the record. The gun did not fire. The Sergeant York was built so that a human crewman had to give the command to shoot, and no such command was given. What the machine did was stranger than a single wild shot would have been. Its radar, the proven eye that was supposed to pick a fast helicopter out of a cluttered sky, had looked across the field and decided that the most interesting thing in front of it was a grandstand full of people. The system found the wrong target, locked on, and aimed exactly as designed at the thing it had wrongly chosen. A radar that could be fooled by a crowd of people standing still had no business being trusted against a small, fast helicopter that meant to stay hidden. The explanation that followed did little to settle nerves. A Ford manager accounted for the malfunction by noting that the vehicle had been washed before the demonstration and that water had gotten into the electronics and thrown off the targeting. The excuse traveled badly. A reporter covering the program asked, in print, whether it was thought that it never rained in Central Europe, the very place this gun was meant to fight. A weapon that could be confused by a wash before a show would have to survive rain, snow, mud, and the filth of an actual war. The defense offered for the failure described, without meaning to, a deeper problem with the whole machine. For the program's managers, the demonstration could still be filed as an embarrassment rather than a verdict. Show day failures happen. Prototypes are temperamental, and a single bad afternoon in front of guests is the sort of thing engineers expect to chase down and fix before the systems reach the field. The Army had reasons of its own to keep that hope alive because the accelerated plan it had chosen tied the production schedule to the calendar rather than to proof that the gun worked. Money for the next batch was set to be released on a date, not on a result. That choice is the quiet center of the Sergeant York story. The General Accounting Office, the government's own auditors, later looked hard at the strategy and found that the Army had deliberately scheduled less testing before production than was normal in order to field the gun faster. The trade-off was that the people deciding whether to keep spending did not yet have solid information about how the gun behaved under realistic conditions. The thin information had already cost the program once. An earlier planned purchase had been struck from the defense budget because there was too little hard data to justify it. The reviewing stand failure was a warning sign, and the structure of the program made it easy to treat a warning sign as a fluke. So production rolled forward while the radar's habits remained unproven. The turret swinging toward the stands could be blamed on a hose and a careless wash crew. It was harder to explain away what the same radar would do once the first real production vehicles left the line and went to the testers, away from the cameras and the visiting brass, where the only audience was a set of engineers with clipboards and a list of things the gun was supposed to be able to do. What they saw there was a habit, and the next thing the radar locked onto would be impossible for anyone to file under bad luck. The fan and the phone call. Production vehicles began reaching the testers in 1984. What they found was worse than a single bad afternoon in front of guests, because now the failures came with the steadiness of a routine. One incident from this period became the line everyone remembers, and it deserves to be told accurately because the accurate version is stranger than the joke it turned into. During testing, one of the early production guns aimed its radar at a field latrine and locked on. The radar had been built to track the rotor of a Soviet helicopter, a small, fast-spinning thing that throws back a faint and tricky signal. A latrine ventilation fan also spins. To the radar, the turning blades of the toilet fan looked enough like a slow-moving aerial target that the system fixed on them and reported a lock. The gun built to clear the sky of attack helicopters had found and chosen the fan on an outhouse. It was the kind of failure that needs no translation. The most expensive air defense weapon the Army had ever bought, tracking a toilet. What happened next is the part that belongs in the file. A reporter named Michael Duffy, who wrote for an industry newsletter called Defense Week, learned of the incident and prepared to publish it. Before the story ran, officials from Ford got him on a conference call and asked him to drop the word latrine and to describe the target instead as a building fan or an exhaust fan, something with a little more dignity than a toilet. The detail was later reported by the writer Greg Easterbrook in the Washington Monthly. The lock-on is one receipt. The phone call asking reporters to dress up the word is another. Behind the comedy sat engineering problems that the testers were documenting in plain language, and they all traced back to the same proven radar the Army had been so confident about. the radar could not reliably separate a helicopter hovering low over the ground from the trees and clutter behind it. A helicopter sitting still just above a tree line, which is exactly how the Soviets meant to fight, gave back a signal the system struggled to distinguish from the landscape. The thing the gun most needed to destroy was the thing it was worst at seeing. The prototypes the contractors had handed over for testing turned out to be less finished than anyone had counted on, and joining these borrowed pieces into one working weapon proved a far larger job than the plan had assumed. There were more failures stacked on top of that one. When the guns elevated to fire at a target high in the air, the raised barrel swung up into the radar's own field of view and confused the set that was trying to track the target. The weapon got in the way of its own eye. Against a helicopter that popped up and hovered, the system took something like 10 or 11 seconds to react, far too long against an enemy that meant to show itself for only a few seconds at a time. The turret turned too slowly to follow a fast-moving aircraft across the sky. Each of these had been supposed to be a solved problem, handled by the mature parts the whole plan rested on. Bolted together into one machine, the proven parts produced a gun that could be reliably beaten by a tree line, a wash crew, or a portable toilet. The pattern matters more than any single absurd moment. A demonstration can fail because a hose got into the wiring. A program does not fail that way. By 1984, the Sergeant York had shown again and again, in front of cameras and away from them, that its central component did not do the one job the entire design depended on. The borrowed radar, the part that had made the whole accelerated bet look safe, was the part that could not be trusted. The radar found grandstands. It found latrines. When it was pointed at the targets it had been built to destroy, it often could not find them at all. For a while, the official word stayed hopeful. The program manager inside the Army spoke of strong reliability figures and of problems being worked through. That optimism had structural reasons behind it, the same ones the auditors would later criticize, namely, a program built to keep moving on schedule and a circle of decision-makers kept small enough that hard news traveled slowly. But the news was getting out anyway, into the trade press, and then the national press, and into the offices of people who had the power to stop the spending. One of those offices had been created by Congress for this exact purpose, and it was about to give the Sergeant York the one thing the program had spent years avoiding: an honest and independent test. 4 reflectors and a failing mark. Congress had already built the watchdog for exactly this moment. In 1983, it passed a law creating an independent office of operational testing, headed by a director who reported straight to the Secretary of Defense, rather than to the services whose weapons he judged. The point of the office was to keep a program from grading its own homework. The Sergeant York would be one of the first major weapons to face it. Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, ordered a fresh round of tests under battlefield conditions, and he tied the release of further production money to a single condition. The gun had to be certified as meeting the performance written into its contract. If it could do what Ford had promised, the program would go on. If it could not, the money would stop. A year earlier, in September 1984, Weinberger had already pulled the next year's production money out of the budget and held off buying any more guns until these results were in. The tests were run and watched by the new independent office. The results were laid out in detail that left little room for spin. The gun was given drones to shoot at. When it could not handle a drone flying in a straight line, the testers made the task easier and gave it a target that simply hovered in place. The radar still could not hold a lock. To get the system to see the hovering drone at all, the testers began bolting radar reflectors onto the target, metal pieces that throw back a far stronger signal than a real aircraft ever would. They added one. They added more. In the end, they had fastened as many as 4 reflectors to a single drone before the proven radar could reliably find a target sitting still in front of it. Set against the contract, the numbers told a split story that the auditors at the General Accounting Office later recorded. In the initial production test, the gun met or exceeded 141 of the 163 specifications that were checked. 141 out of 163 sounds like a passing grade, until you look at which ones it failed. 7 of the 22 misses were judged by the Army's own evaluators to be the specifications that mattered most, covering the reliability of the system and its ability to find and engage what it was shooting at. A gun can satisfy most of a long checklist and still fail at the few lines that decide whether it works. The harder verdict came from the operational tests, the ones meant to mimic real combat. The independent director's assessment, the one the Secretary of Defense accepted, found that the Sergeant York offered only a marginal improvement over the older weapons it was supposed to replace, that it was ineffective at the air defense mission it existed to perform, and that it was unsuitable for combat because it broke down too often to be relied on. The system reached an operational availability of about 33% against a requirement of 90%. For roughly 2 days out of every 3, the gun protecting an armored column could be expected to be out of action. That was the file that landed on Weinberger's desk in the late summer of 1985. Years of optimism, of schedule pressure, of proven parts that refused to behave once assembled, had come down to a stack of test results that said the same thing in several different ways. The gun did not work well enough to send to war. The condition Weinberger had set could not be met because the certification the law required could not honestly be signed. What remained was the decision itself, and it came within days. Weinberger ends it. On the 27th of August, 1985, the decision came down from the Secretary of Defense. Caspar Weinberger canceled the Sergeant York after 64 of a planned 614 guns had been delivered. His reasoning was as plain as a man can make it. Whatever improvements might still be wrung out of the gun, he said, were not worth the additional money it would take to chase them, so the spending would stop. There is a twist in the wreckage that the auditors took care to record, and it runs against the easy version of this story. The Sergeant York had held its budget. The fixed price contract and the tough warranty that the Army had built in 1981 did the job they were meant to do. The General Accounting Office found that, right up to the day it was canceled, the program had kept its costs under control, close to what had been promised, while many other weapons of the era ran wildly over their estimates. By the one measure the Pentagon worried about most going in, the Sergeant York was a success. The money was controlled. The weapon was the failure. The contract had been written with great care to make sure the taxpayer did not overpay, and it worked. At the end of it, the taxpayer had paid a controlled and predictable price for a gun that could not be sent to war. Roughly $1.8 billion had gone out the door by the time Weinberger pulled the plug. That figure bought 64 guns, a stack of test failures, and a turret that had aimed at a grandstand and a latrine, but rarely at an aircraft. Of those 64, only about 50 ever reached the field. The full production run of 614 systems had been priced at around $4.04 billion. Canceling when he did spared the Treasury the far larger sum it would have taken to finish buying a gun already known not to work. The $1.8 billion already spent could not be recovered. The plan had promised a finished weapon in about 6.5 years. At cancellation, 10 years after the program began, the Army was still projecting that the Sergeant York would not be ready before 1987. The radar that had been the heart of the machine, the proven component that justified the whole accelerated plan, had been the thing that broke the program, and no amount of careful contracting had saved it. For Weinberger, the choice in the end was simple arithmetic. He had a law that required honest certification, an independent office that would not provide it, and a gun that could not pass an honest test. The accelerated plan that was supposed to save years had instead delivered, after 8 of them, a weapon fit only to be retired. 8 years on, the field still had no gun to guard its tanks from the air, which was the exact problem the whole program had been launched to solve. The Sergeant York had run out of room to fail. What was left was the question of what to do with the guns that had already been built, and the Army's answer to that question would be the last word on the program. Targets on the range. Most of the vehicles the taxpayer had paid for never saw combat. The Army, with no use for a gun it had just declared unfit, did with them what it does with worn-out equipment. It hauled the bulk of the fleet out to Air Force bombing ranges and set them up as targets. The Sergeant York, built to shoot down aircraft, spent its last service being shot at by them, sitting still on the desert floor while planes practiced their runs on the wreck. A few escaped to that end. A handful of the guns were kept and scattered to museums and military parks around the country. One of them sits today at the Sergeant Alvin York State Historic Park in Pall Mall, Tennessee, the small town where the real Sergeant York was born, the World War I rifleman whose name had been borrowed to promise an accuracy the gun never had. The radar still sits on top of the surviving hulls, the proven eye that was supposed to find Soviet helicopters across a cluttered battlefield. It had found a grandstand full of officers. It had found the ventilation fan of a latrine. The aircraft it was built to destroy, it could rarely find at all. In the end, it was switched off for good, a dead instrument on a heavy old tank chassis, parked on a lawn in Tennessee for visitors to walk past. The gun that could lock onto almost anything except its target had become, at last, a target itself. The record on the Sergeant York is not in dispute. The General Accounting Office laid it out for the Senate in 1986, a gun acquired on an accelerated plan that held its budget and failed its mission, canceled after 64 of 614 planned systems and roughly $1.8 billion. The independent testing office that Congress had created found it ineffective at the job it was built for and unsuitable for combat. Those are the findings on the page, in the government's own hand. The rest is scattered across a few lawns. Out on the old bombing ranges, the steel that did not make it to a museum has long since been broken up and carried off. In Pall Mall, Tennessee, one Sergeant York sits in the open air near the home of the man it was named for, its twin barrels raised at a sky it could never reliably clear, its radar dark. A visitor can stand beside it today, read the small sign, and decide for himself what $1.8 billion bought.